in the meantime, we are moving forward to our next speaker, who is also joining us for not the first time, and he's one of the people actually who made this conference come true. Because when last year I was thinking long and hard, if the world really needs another storytelling conference, like, look at the world, who needs a storytelling conference when, like, I won't mention anything, but you know what I'm thinking about right now. And this person was Geoff Mead, who I had a chat. Hi, Geoff.
Hi.
It was lovely to have a chat with you in a coffee shop, and you really got me inspired about the possibilities that we can go for in terms of story work. And even though you didn't say, like, story can change the world, you gave me hope among the many people who I've emailed, and thanks to you. So let's give our fires to Geoff, who's joining us once again. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real honor.
It's good to be here. And you get.
Oh, what a cutie pie, says Karina. I agree with that.
Yeah, well, I need a prop. I need props.
That's good.
I need props.
All right,
Yeah.
I'll be off the air, so it's all yours, and thank you so much. Let me know when I can hold your slides up.
Okay. Well, let me just say one or two things first, and then I'll ask Artem to put the slides up. So, of course, I don't know who's out there, but whoever is out there, hello. I'm Geoff Mead, and what do I want to start with? I suppose I start by saying I've been doing this work at With Story for a long time. And what I'm coming up with is more questions than answers. And like everybody, I'm concerned with many things that are going on in the world. And I've been reflecting as a story worker about what is our role, not just in general terms, but for me too. So in what ways do I help people find a way through these predicaments, and in what ways am I actually complicit in them, consciously and unconsciously? So when Artem invited me to speak at the conference, I thought for quite a long time. I thought, well, what do I have to say, or what might I want to share? And I think what I'm coming with is more a challenge than an answer, and it's a challenge as much to myself as to anyone listening, because I think these are questions that are important, and I certainly find them easier not to ask. But anyway, this morning, and it's morning here where I am in Gloucestershire in England, I'm going to ask some of me and us and invite us to reflect together on some of these questions. And I'm hoping, if my timing is right, there'll be an opportunity for you to respond in writing to something. I don't mean in the chat box. I mean, I have in mind to do a little exercise and prompt something, invite you to write something for yourself. We won't have a time to tell story or invite you to tell your stories on screen, but as a way of experimenting with some of this material. So if you can, I ask that you have to hand something to write with and something to write on. I think stories are analog, and often our best starting point for writing is paper, pen and paper, but then it's entirely up to you. So that's the spirit in which I'm coming. Artem, could you put the slides up, please? And then we'll see if I can manage to negotiate this technology. Thank you. Okay, so the title I thought of, it was Coming Back to Life, and I've borrowed this title, as you'll see later, from an author called Joanna Macy. And my subtitle for it is Storytelling with Heart and Soul. And these two words are really important to me. When I wrote a book in 2014, the subtitle was, it was called Telling the Story, the Heart and Soul of Successful Leadership. And it was a difficult negotiation with the publisher to get the title right. And that's not my first choice in terms of telling the story. However, I absolutely would not budge on having the words heart and soul in the title, because I think they are essential elements of our work, and never more so than now. So what do I mean by heart and soul? This is a Mexican little device, and they call it a corazon en llamas. That's a terrible pronunciation. I apologize for any Spanish speakers. It means a heart on fire. And I love this combination of the two images, because for me, heart is about courage as well as feeling, and fire stands for imagination. And in the work that I'm doing with clients, and hopefully in the work that I do in my own kind of creative realm, I try to open the space for the heart and for the imagination. When I work in boardrooms, which I've been doing the last few years, I talk about imaginative labor, that it is your role, chairman, chief executive, directors, to imagine the future of your organization and the consequences of its actions. Because if you don't, who will? So the theme of the conference, as Artem said, kind of emerged really in a conversation, thinking about, the world has many, many divisions in it. Some of those divisions are internal to us. Some of them are within our own societies. Some of them are between societies, between nations. They are certainly divisions between the human world and the more than human world. And I'm curious about what role story might have to play in trying to, I was going to say bridge. I'm not even sure bridge is the right thing. I think the word is transcend. Some of these divisions are so fixed that actually addressing them head on doesn't seem to help. So what I want to do is suggest to you a principle, and I think it probably may be common to what many of the speakers had to say, but actually what we need to do is look at the bigger picture, whether it's about ourselves, our organizations, our societies, our nations, then it's perhaps, and I say perhaps by helping us look at what the bigger picture might be that offers some hope for transcending these things. And I don't think these are problems that you can just solve. These are predicaments that we have to live through. And the question is, how do we live through them rather than how do we fix them? This is a picture, a famous picture taken in 1990. In fact, on Valentine's Day, 1990, February 14th, 1990, by the spacecraft Voyager 1. From a distance of 6 billion kilometers, that tiny dot in the middle of the screen is Earth. It kind of put things in perspective, doesn't it? Because that is all we have, and that is all we are. In the infinitude of space, we are a small, pale blue dot. And yet, from the surface, we don't see that. We see the divisions, we see the differences, we see the problems. So one of my contentions is that many of the stories that we tell are too small. They're too close to the bone. We tell stories with our eyes down. We try and fix immediate problems with them, immediate issues. And what if we found ways to look up? What if we found ways to look beyond, look to the horizon? How can we encourage ourselves and our clients as story workers to do that? I'm thinking about the apocryphal story, of the boiled frog, the frog that sits in the water that's heating and heating and heating, and doesn't realize. And it's, if you imagine a whole group of frogs in a pot of water that's boiling steadily, no one is saying the water's boiling. They're arguing about the quality of the water or whose water it is. And no story is going to fix that, except a story that transcends the immediate squabbles, that looks up and says, well, what's the big picture here? What's the picture that we're actually working within? So there are kind of rhetorical questions I want to suggest we look at, and they have to do with us and our organizations and beyond. So the first sort of question that I encourage us to think about, and these are, if you like, points at which we might work with others as story workers. So what stories or self-stories do we avoid looking at? What are the stories that we carry that are more convenient for us not to acknowledge? So what might that be for me? Well, one of them might be the ways in which I'm complicit with the problems. We all are working within systems, and we all have to make a living within systems, and yet we're seeking to challenge those systems. So when am I falling short of my own standards? And what self-stories might support me in standing up and being braver and allowing my imagination more scope? The second is story as a social phenomenon. Whose stories do we exclude? Whose stories do not count in our world or the organization in which we're living, working? I'll give you a small practical example. I went to do some work in an agrochemical company, I won't name it, about storytelling. And part of my aim was to encourage them to think more broadly about the impact of their work in the world, some of which, of course, is very helpful and hugely profitable. And I tried to raise a conversation over dinner about organic farming. And you would think that I'd taken my trousers down and bent over in the middle of the room. It was a story that could not be spoken in that context. I did some work with a charity, a medical charity, and they do fabulous work. And I mentioned the word homeopathy. I said, I'm just going to give you a homeopathic dose of something. And there was an audible gasp in the room. Those stories don't have a place here. So I think one of the issues that we might challenge ourselves with as story workers is, what are the stories that are not getting told in this context, around this boardroom, with this group of leaders? And how do we encourage people to open to a wider range of stories? And I'll be talking a little bit and offering some possibilities, I hope, in a little while. And the bigger question, I suppose, is what are the stories that govern how we see the world? These, if you like, from the notion of fish don't see the water they're swimming in, these are the waters that we swim in. These are the stories that shape our perceptions, that distort our perceptions, that limit our perceptions, that conceivably free and liberate our conceptions of what the world is like. So here's one big story, and it's not political. You might say that most of the world, much of it, has lived within the story or the myth of the industrial growth society for 150 years. In other words, we live as though the story that the world has infinite resource was true. We live as if the story that we can act without consequence is true. And yet we can't. And it's really only very recently that it has become almost impossible to accept that story as a given. And so we're now living in that time which is beyond that story. We know it doesn't work, but we haven't got a new story. We're living in an era of narrative wreckage, a predicament that we as story workers can help people work through and live through, but I don't believe we can find answers that will fix it. That's my philosophical position, and I'm sorry if it's a bit, sounds a bit pessimistic. I think it's realistic. Okay, so we have these questions and we have ways of seeing the world, and let's bring this down to earth a little bit. And I do much of my work with story in organizations, as I suspect many of you do. Let me then talk a little bit about one way of conceptualizing this problem that provides some points of entry for us as story workers. And I'm going to offer you some thoughts that originated with this man here, who's Jürgen Habermas, and his theory of communicative action. I'm not going to be all academic-y on you, but there's a primary idea that he expresses better than anyone else I know And that is a notion that as societies industrialize in our industrial and post-industrial age, there came a fundamental split between what you might call the system world and the life world. Here's my little image for that, just as a meme to remember it. And what he says is that within these worlds, and the system world is the world of organizations, corporations, governments, and the life world is our day-to-day lived social, personal life. And these two have become radically divided, he says. And I think that's the experience of many people. I work with lots of people who talk about work-life balance as if these things were quite separate. People who spend 90, 100, 120 hours a week at work and don't consider that living. They don't make the connection that this is your life, this is our lives. So the way we want to live our life and the way we are at work have fundamentally different logics. And that's a problem, because the organizations have a logic which is basically functional rationality. They are set up to achieve things. They tend to be short-term local goals and targets. We evaluate things against the notion of progress. We're looking for efficiency, economic measurement. And we set up procedures, routines, and policies, and we organize through hierarchies and promotions and careers. And it has a kind of a wonderfully solipsistic logic. It works within its own domain. But, and here's the big but, it's not the same as how we want to live as human beings. Anyone, take you out of work, or take me out of work, or take us out of the boardroom and say, what's important? And you start getting this kind of answers. You know, that the life world is universal. What people want is the same. Everyone wants to have a reasonably comfortable, safe, secure life with the possibility of family and community. Things that are important about love and friendship and family, and finding ways of expressing personal philosophy and creativity, belonging to a community. Things like culture, art, sport, recreation, things like beliefs, faith, religion, and philosophy, and a possibility of self-actualization, of self-expression beyond simple organizational achievement. Now, these two things are different, fundamentally and qualitatively different. And I think story is one of the ways, it's one of the few ways I know that we can try to bring them together. Because if we don't, we get decisions made that have catastrophic consequences. We rip the earth apart. We are in an era of climate change and global warming, which is a direct result of human activity, all of which within the logic of the system world was perfectly sensible, the right thing to do. We are losing species. There are 15,500 species currently at risk of extinction. These are not trivial things. They are very hard to face. Very hard to face. And what do? Well, what we often do is look away. There was a really good, I thought it was a good film anyway, in 2021. It was called Don't Look Up. And the premise was, and I'm not saying this is the case now at all, but the premise was in this film, and if you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. Well, there's that a large meteorite was on its way directly for Earth. And scientists came and reported all that to government throughout the world, and people just ignored it. They went on with their lives. They couldn't bear the consequences of facing into the difficulty. And I think that's what we do. I think we often don't look up. We look down because that's bearable. It's easier. We know how to do it. All the things that we do in organizations, the ways that we are at work, the ways that we are in society, the ways that we are as nations, we know how to do. They are all difficult, tragic as some of them are easier than facing into the real issues that we face. Okay, that's enough doom mongering. what I'd like to do is to share with you some thoughts about how we might work with this. In organizational life, I do very simple things. I get people around boardrooms to step away from their work and tell simple, personal, everyday stories to each other. Stories of times in their lives that's brought them joy, stories of their family, stories of holidays, stories of personal achievement away from work, stories of falling in love, simple everyday stories. And what I invariably experience is that for a time, a little time at least, we create a shift in the way people communicate. We bring together the life world and the system world. We invite people into a space where they can bring those human concerns into the boardroom and start to make different decisions. So I don't know, obviously, who you are, and I'll have a look in the chat box when I stop talking. But it's interesting to me, and I've been working in this field for 25 years or so. In the last 2 or 3 years, I have been working with and in the boardrooms of some really interesting large global companies. And I'm beginning to see a greater willingness to address these questions. Not because of anything I do really, but because people around that table are often have a family, their children, their stage of life, they're often in midlife, their children are growing or grown up, and their children are saying, what is it you do? What is it you do? And what is the world that you're creating that we are inheriting? So it's an interesting and challenging time, but I do see glimmers of possibility and possible openings, and in some places a greater willingness to confront, but they need help. And one of the ways of creating those possibilities of different conversations, I find, is to go small and invite the life world into the system world. Okay, I want to introduce you to, and someone you may well know, but if you don't, she's a wonderful woman. This is Joanna Macy. She's in her 90s now, an extraordinary figure. And she is what you might call a deep ecologist. So if this is about changing perspective, and it is, what's the difference? And all her work is about helping people look up, face into the issues that are there, and make choices, life choices about what to do. And I worked with her many years ago. I say worked with her. I had the enormous pleasure of being on a week-long workshop with her 25 years ago. And it's one of the reasons I became a storyteller. I decided to work with story in organizations because I felt it was a useful thing to do in the context of our situation. So here's the difference between environmentalism, a good thing. We humans are responsible for this planet and we have to look after it, to a deep ecology. Deep ecology says we are part of this. We are not at the top of a pyramid. We are intrinsically part of what is happening. And if we could shift our perception, our point of view, from ego to eco, if the stories we're interested in, the stories we tell, come from a perspective of being involved in, being part of, participating in a system rather than running or simply, exploiting a system, then the way we are in the world will change. Is it enough? I have no idea. Is it essential? I think it has to be. So here's a little thing that came out some years ago. You may have seen it. It was a cartoon in the New Yorker by Tom Toro in 2012. I've shown this to a lot of people in boardrooms, and it makes them think. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. And this is the wonderful apotheosis, or the ultimate consequence of system world and life world not talking to each other. From an ecological point of view, it's impossible for them not to talk to each other. The perspective has to change. This is one way of looking at the world. Here's another. It's the same world. Joanna Macy offers many different ways of changing our perspective to look at the world, storied ways of doing it. And I want to just offer a couple to you. I'll have to check with Artem how time is going in a minute, but here's one. What if we looked at the world from the perspective of another species? Instead of wondering what we think, can we project our imaginations into the sentient, beating heart and mind of others? Can we see the world, or attempt to see the world, or imagine that we see the world from that point of view? And what's the consequence of that if we do? How might it affect our decisions? And I'm going to skip a slide, I might come back to it, but there is an exercise that you can do, and I'm not going to invite you to do this right now because I need to check time with Artem. But this is about asking the fundamental question, what does the world want to say to us? And I've done this activity live with people over the course of a day, but essentially you choose a different perspective, and that you've been invited to speak from that perspective about your way of life, how the future looks for you, what you need or want from humans, and what you would like to give human beings. And here's a second way of looking at things. The Iroquois nation, in their deliberations, required the elders and all involved in decision making to consider the consequences of their decisions for the 7th generation. Extraordinary, isn't it? Something that is easier to imagine perhaps in that indigenous culture and that hunter-gatherer or low-key industrial agricultural society. And a way of doing that, and again I've done this activity and I've brought people in organizations into this as well, is to project yourself into the future and look back. What if you were having a conversation with your own grandchildren in 30 years' time? What are the questions that they would ask you, and what would you answer? And the object of it is not to castigate, not to punish, but to stimulate, to provoke, to invite people to consider where we are and what possible options there are. And always with Joanna Macy, there's a mixture of, I think, grief and gratitude in the work. Where is the joy in how things are, and how does that sustain us? So here's my final thing I want to say, is that the stories we tell are fateful. This is my language, not Joanna Macy's, but this is a fundamental belief, I think, of mine. But how we embody it as story workers is really challenging. That our ability to change anything, ourselves, our organizations, and our world, depends on our capacity to reimagine them. Nothing changes unless the stories change. And this takes heart and soul, takes courage and imagination. And I think that our work as story workers in organizations, actually anywhere, has implicit in it is something about how we can bring people to that, and also how we can bring ourselves to have courage and imagination in the work that we do. So can we help ourselves look up? Can we help the organizations that we work with look up? Can we do so in a way which is expressing humanity, our common humanity, rather than just criticizing? Because we are complicit, without doubt. We are complicit in this world and in this work. So I don't have, this is not a session in which I can offer you, I'm afraid, a sort of quick answer or a simple technique, but I can propose that these ways of working that Joanna Macy has given us really over many years of work offer some possibilities. They are things that perhaps need us to shape in order that our audience can meet them, but we can use them. We can draw on that kind of approach to invite people into a bigger space, bigger stories, and stories that help us look up. And I have seen changes. I have seen organizations really begin to think about how they position themselves in the world, fundamental questions of stance and what we're here to do. I'm working with a number of organizations now who are fundamentally committed to net zero and are making huge, dramatic changes in the way they work in order to achieve that. So I'm not without hope that change is happening. But I do believe we're in a predicament and our job is to live through it and help people live through it. I don't think we're going to fix it. I think that's probably enough, Artem. I want to stop talking and see where we are in terms of questions. I was optimistic that I might have time to give you a chance to write in response to something, but I don't think we have. But you will have these slides and they are things that you can look at, I think, at leisure rather than try and rush something right now. I've talked more than I thought I would. Which is, as you know, Artem, is often the case with me. So shall I turn this off now? Is that a good thing to do?
We have participants asking for the next slide, but guys, again, it's
okay. I can do that. You mean this one here? The next slide is me doing a bit of shameless self-promotion.
I've copied the link to your book into the chat.
Fine.
And guys, everyone, we will have the slides in the recording, so you can use them. Yeah. Recordings will be available afterwards. Geoff, we have till 5 minutes till the hour, so 11 minutes. If you want to, you can give us some, or we can just have a discussion.
Let's have a discussion. I think I've heard the sound of my own voice talking into the distance long enough. How do I turn these off?
Oh, let me help you.
Okay, thank you. So I apologize. I haven't been able to respond as I went along to questions or comments at all. So let's see where we are with this. And I'm conscious this is a provocation. So let's see if you've been provoked.
Guys, if you have questions for Geoff, now it would be the right time to ask them. We still have 10 minutes because we are going a bit over the time with the previous pitch. And with my with me being the one behind it. So Geoff, this every time you give us a bigger perspective, and thank you so much. I remember reading your book and stumbling upon this exercise with the seventh generation for the first time, and it really made me think. So, if I may, can you give us a practical example of a group that followed this exercise by your lead, and maybe what happened to them afterwards?
Gosh, can I do that? I have to think about confidentiality.
Well, you cannot name it like the name of a company, or if it's okay, of course.
Let me think how best to respond. I think it's very difficult to see. I mean, this is a kind of an act of faith, really, because we're hoping to make a shift in people's thinking and feeling. And I don't believe this work is such that you do see an immediate result. I can give you an example of a kind of a shift that this way of encouraging boards to think does, this bringing together of life world and system world. So rather than attach it to the seventh generation specifically, let me think of this. So this is working with, this is a global IT company, okay? Not Apple, but a global IT company. And with a local board, a UK board of a large global company. And we used this kind of personal storytelling to open the space. And then we encouraged them to talk about who they were as a story character. And it was pretty clear that their biggest characteristic was they were huge. So they were a giant. And the question, so we then got them thinking about, let's forget what you want to do, what decision you want to make. If you're a giant, let's play. What kind of giant do you want to be? What kind of giant are you? And have you seen The Big Friendly Giant, the cartoon film? I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a wonderful film. It's a Roald Dahl story. And there's a lovely film that came out a few years ago, which many people know. In fact, all these people on the board knew. And there are many different giants in this thing. And so they identified that the way that they were seen, and there was some truth in it, was they were kind of the nasty gobble flesh eater giant. You know, they were rapacious. They took and they wanted to control things, and they didn't necessarily want to work by fear, but there was a way in which their relationship with the countries in their work was quite what's the word, sort of demanding. They set standards. They were very introverted in their thinking. They realized that there'd never be anything but a giant. But what if they wanted? What kind of giant did they want to be? So they then started talking about being the big friendly giant. You know, what is that? Well, that's a giant that actually helps people connect with their dreams, that nourishes, that tends a garden. And what if we conceived of ourselves not simply as engineers who make things, fix things, do things, make money, but actually as people who are extremely important in the economic, ecology of a country and a thing, and saw ourselves as actually help. And this was during the pandemic, helping the countries that we work in create the conditions for healthy growth, right? So it's a mindset. Now, how will these changes come about? I really don't know. Will I ever get the chance to see? I don't know. But I think without opening up these imaginative spaces, I just don't think it's possible at all. So I can't say we did this and that happened. I wish I could. And one of the comments in the thing is, yes, it really is an act of faith. And how do you navigate the client's desire for immediate results with the knowledge that this isn't possible? It's really difficult. It's really, really difficult. And you know, I don't know is the answer. I think we nudge, we encourage. I have a lovely story of a friend of mine who was working, and there is a company, I won't name it, but it was a huge mining company, global company. And it had done some terrible things, you know, ripped the heart out of several African countries, caused terrible problems everywhere. And the chief exec was at this session, and my friend was doing work which was addressing the kind of the human conditions of what's happening. And he was absolutely inspired. He went back to his board and he said, we can't go on doing this. And the first thing they did was, and it took 10 years, the first thing they did was invest billions in clearing up the mess. All their sites were restored. They restored the area. They're from these terrible scarred things. You know, that picture I showed of that great big wheel. I don't know if it was one of theirs, but that's the kind of thing they did. They're all green sites. And then they sold and got rid of all their mining job. And they are now the world's leading company in reusing metals, specific precious metals. What's the word? Recovery and reuse. Oh, this is a word I can't think of. But they completely changed the nature of the organization. And it's very interesting because I was very inspired by that. And there's a little film of this guy talking about it. And I showed this film, 9 minutes, to a group of senior executives from another company completely. It happened to be a North American company. I judged it wrong. I made the wrong judgment. They were so horrified. I think they were so challenged by it that they almost threw me out of the room. Because it is fun, it's hugely challenging, you know, because the challenge is, there's a wonderful poem of Rilke's. I don't know if you know, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. It's called The Archaic Apollo of the Archaic Torso of Apollo. So he has found, Rilke the poet, came across in a museum a Greek statue of Apollo. And he's describing it. And he's just describing what it is. And then the very last line ends, you must change your life. Right? Confronted by this thing, the only possible question that comes up is, you must change your life. How? I don't know, but the impact is huge. And changing our lives is difficult. I haven't got the answer. I still earn a living in ways sometimes I think, was that the right place to be? Am I actually supporting this? Do I work with this organization at all? Now, I don't work with tobacco and I don't work with so-called defense. They're my two kind of no-go areas. I simply can't find a moral stance that feels good enough for me to do that. But I work with pretty much everyone else in the hope that I can do some good. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes the agrochemical company, the resistance is so strong that you think, well, I tried, and okay, now I'll recoup, try and do something to nourish my own energy and find another place where I can work. So it's this dance between where is the work needed and how do I get paid? I mean, all that kind of stuff we have to handle. And then within that, what are the opportunities? Quite small, but what are the opportunities to open people to these bigger questions? And I work quite a lot on leadership programs. Multinational companies have these big leadership programs. I work through a couple of business schools, and I get the opportunity to come in at a formative stage quite often with people about to move into senior leadership roles, and we work with story. And I'm increasingly getting people to work with their personal stories that kind of bring up where do I belong, what do I want to serve, put my life in service of, and what really matters to me. And at those moments, you get a chance to help people think through, tell them what's right, but to really kind of connect with the roots. And as you know from my work on narrative leadership, I think we earn the right to stand for something by firstly listening to what really matters to us as humans, as human beings, and therefore connect with those deep personal stories. And then we connect with what stories, what's the world asking of us? And somewhere between those two, listening, connecting, and drawing up is our place in the world, where we can stand, what we stand for. So there we go.
You are an incredible person who, just by saying, I don't know how to solve it, can keep the attention for a really, really long time. And it's so validating. I agree with Alexis on this. I second what she's writing. It's really validating that we don't know how to solve it. But it is also validating that you as a person came to this event and so many people have been listening to you. And that means we are all looking for the answer. So guys, if you have enjoyed this, please share your appreciation, your fire with Geoff. I feel this was incredible. And while you're doing that, Geoff, I have one last question to you.
Yes. So, sure.
Yeah, you know it. By coming to this conference, you've stated with your action the meaning of a story. People can cross the borders for a greater cause. What's one more meaning you would like to inspire people about so we have more connections in our torn apart world?
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, well, I caught the tail end of the previous speaker, right? And the essence of that for me is we connect partly through telling a story, but we connect so much better by listening, by asking by being interested in someone else's story. And you've seen my little day-to-day exercise I do. Given half a chance, that's what people want to do. I would say start small in this work. Don't ask people to step into great big things straight away. Start small, help people connect in the simple human level where they are listening to, as well as telling a little simple story, and then get them to reflect on, appreciate what happened when they did that. And in that moment, within 10 minutes, people go from here to there, and they experience it for real, in the room. You've got it. Heart and fire, heart and soul, courage and imagination.
Thank you. I
It's
really
a great
appreciate
pleasure. I
that.
hope that was all right. My grand plans for getting people to do wonderful exercise complete went out the window because I talked. But hopefully they're available to people to look at and play. And they do take time. So if you're interested, on it, pick it up from the slides and have a go. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, guys, this is a recommendation I would really follow, and you can learn more in Geoff's book. Geoff, it was amazing, and every time you just nail it, and
You're
ask more
very kind.
questions to
Thank
thanks
you
to.
very much. Thank you. Have a
Thank you
great
so
rest of
much.
conference, and I wish I'd been able to be present for more of it. And I would like, in return, to appreciate your courage and imagination, Artem, in the world and in this conference. Thank you.